there is absolutely no way that the European nations, without American support, can provide any form of security guarantee for Ukraine.
Before we get to the spending, what about the principle? I mean, you have been very, very senior in NATO, which is the North Atlantic Alliance, bringing America and Canada in with the Europeans. Do you think it is now beginning to crack beyond repair?
No, not beyond repair. I think there is a rebalancing of NATO, which, frankly, if you are an American, is long overdue. Really, since 1945, and particularly since the end of the Cold War, we have been using the guarantee of American force and American contribution to NATO as a reason for us to ramp down our defense spending. In the late 1980s, the height of the Cold War, it was 5% roughly. And since then, there's been a gradual reduction with funds going away to other worthy causes, important social programs, the NHS. And the reason that was possible was because there was an absence of a significant threat from Russia, and there was this US guarantee. And of course, now both those have changed fundamentally. And therefore, it's extremely important that we look at our defense spending and ramp it up. And I thought it was fascinating that in her resignation letter, Annalise Dodds, the International Development Minister, said that 2.5% now, 3% perhaps in the next parliament, but that may only be the beginning. And that is coming from somebody who is right at the left wing of the Labour Party. So I think there's a consensus across the political spectrum that it is time now for the UK and indeed all European nations to look to their defence and start playing their proper part, which they have not been doing.
A couple of points about that, though. The first is that actually, as a share of its national income, American spending is around 3%, which some of the NATO countries have already. And secondly, it is not as if America didn't get something out of the Pax Americana, is it? I mean, they have been able to extend their influence globally with the support of the Europeans. And frankly, for a long time, the last thing anyone wanted was Germany to rearm, for example.
Yeah, that's true. It's actually been about 3.4%, I think. But as the Secretary General of NATO pointed out last night, in terms of combat power, because the Americans have a unified command structure, their 3.4% produce significantly more combat power than the collective and disparate elements of the other European nations. So it's about 50% of the combat power of NATO is provided by the United States. And the European contribution is significantly less. So, I mean, if you move forward to the so-called guarantee that's being requested, there is absolutely no way that the European nations, without American support, can provide any form of security guarantee for Ukraine.
Now, a large chunk of our spending goes on the nuclear deterrent, which is in partnership with America. So going forward, how do you think the UK should configure its forces to consolidate its contribution to NATO?
Well, the point about a lift to 2.5, potentially 3%, is that you do not turn a switch and immediately turn cash into capability. It takes significant planning, and of course, it will take time to ramp up the production lines. It will take research, it'll take training, and it'll take recruiting and then training. So it'll take, I would say, 3 to 4 to 5 years before we reach the full capability, which a 3% or 2.5 to 3% increase in defence spending could produce. In terms of the spectrum, well, that will come out, I think, of the Strategic Defence Review, which is going on at the moment, which is about to report. But it will need to cover the full spectrum. I mean, there was an argument from some that we could move away from conventional aspects, and by that I mean, artillery, infantry, armor. But the reality is, you need that, and you also need the other elements. You need drones, you need cyber, You need capabilities that are to do with surveillance involved with space. So you need something across the full spectrum, which of course is difficult with a limited budget. But
I mean,
that's
do
nevertheless
you
what you
need,
need.
put it simply, do you need 2 aircraft carriers?
I would say that there are areas where you can certainly make reductions, and I think that in the current day, with the limitations and the vulnerability of aircraft carriers, that's something which should be looked at very, very carefully. And I'd be surprised if the Strategic Defence Review does not look at that.
What about the nuclear deterrent? Does that need to be reconfigured so perhaps there's less dependence on the United States?
I think that may be a very long-term aspiration. Right now, I would put it rather differently, and I would say that we should work even harder to try and ensure that we continue to tie in and involve the United States within NATO, within the nuclear deterrent. And the best way of doing that is by demonstrating to the United States that we are going to play our full part, which it includes ramping up our defense spending and making sure that our European partners do the same.
And finally, would it be possible to defend Ukraine without an American backstop?
My view on that is no. It's interesting. I've heard of this reassurance force. I don't know what a reassurance force is. You can have it rather depends on the mandate you're given. It can either be a peace support operation, which means you simply report if there is an incursion, or it can be a peace enforcement operation, which means you fight if there is an incursion. If it's the latter, then Europe simply does not have the capabilities to be able to do that on its own. So some involvement of the United States, as the Secretary General of NATO has pointed out, is important. The engagement with the United States in terms of some kind of backstop, which probably involves the mineral deal, may involve air power, as proposed by General Breedlove, who's an ex-SACEUR. Some form of deal which involves them in those ways needs to be worked out, which means that Ukraine needs to get back into the room and back into back around the negotiating table with the Americans. And I'm delighted to hear this morning that the UK, France and others are going to try and help broker that.
General Sir John McColl, thank you very much indeed for joining us, former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of NATO.